Good evening, everybody. My name is Alan Blumkin. This is the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and we have another edition tonight of David Nemec's old-time history and trivia. And tonight we're going to be discussing the Detroit Tigers, who've been one of the original franchises in the American League. And David is going to talk also about the 19th century National League team, the Detroit Wolverines, who, even though they have no relationship to the Tigers, need to be discussed because it was the first team, Major League team, that hit Detroit. This was back before Detroit had the auto industry and became a city that was able to support major leagues. So welcome, David.
Welcome. Thank you, Al. Pleasure to be with you again.
Okay, so I know that the Wolverines started in 1881.
They did. They replaced the Cincinnati National League franchise and were a doormat pretty much in the early years. They were in the National League. But they made a major acquisition in 1885. They purchased 4-star ball players from the collapsing Buffalo Club and immediately made themselves a formidable contender. And in 1887, Detroit won the National League pennant fairly easily and then blasted away the St. Louis Browns and the American Association champions and became the dominant major league team. But they were a small market team, as Al has talked about. This was prior to the auto industry. They didn't draw well. The team folded after 1 year after winning the pennant and World Series. They left the major league scene at the end of the 1888 season, and then went to a number of minor leagues and ended up in the Western League, which was the predecessor of the American League, and played there from 1894 through 1900. And at the end of the 1900 season, they were among the 8 teams selected by Ban Johnson to form a challenger to the National League, which he had rechristened the American League prior to the 1900 season. And the Detroit franchise is a remarkable one. It's probably in the most stable of all the present major league franchises. It's been based in the same city ever since 1901. It's had the same nickname, the Tigers. They came in with a nickname at day one. They had acquired it with permission from the military unit in Detroit, which was called the Tigers. And not only that, but they opened the season in Bennett Field, which was located on Michigan and Trumbull in Detroit, and that site was the only home of the Detroit Tigers until 2000, when Co-America Park came into existence. So their stability is beyond imitation in the major leagues. They were a strong team from the very outset. Almost always a contender, not necessarily a pennant winner, but usually in the first division. And they were remarkable in the fact that they were, of the 16 original franchises, major league franchises in 1901, they were the last team to finish in last place. They survived 51 seasons of major league play before, and finally in 1952 they finished in the cellar under former Yankees third baseman Red Rolfe. They have remained a strong franchise ever since, and we can start with their history in 1901. And while they were never a pennant threat in the early seasons, they were among the first division teams and always well above 500. Their history started to change in 1905 under manager Bill Armour. Armour was a throwback manager, aggressive players who really went all out in every game, and as a result, Armour was among the kinds of managers who would be willing to accept a minor league player that Detroit had in its system at the time, who was still very young, only 19 years old. His name was Ty Cobb. And Cobb, as soon as he came to the Tigers, was put in the lineup and made the Tigers into an instant contender. And they emerged as the American League the first American League champion to sweep 3 straight pennants in 1907, 1908, and 1909. Unfortunately, they lost the World Series on each occasion, but many more pennants were predicted for the Tigers, and certainly Cobb, as formidable a player as he was expected to win several world championships. As it played out, the Tigers never won again under Cobb, and had to wait a while for their first world championship. Go ahead, Al.
There's all sorts of myths grown up around Ty Cobb all these years. And a couple of them were, one is that because he was from Georgia, and this was 40 years after the Civil War had ended, when he came up, a lot of the teammates that he had were from the North, and really gave him the business from being from the South, and it made him even more aggressive than he was when he came up. He was an instant star, and even though he had run-ins with the teammates, and both Sam Crawford and Davy Jones, who are in the Lawrence Ritter book, Glory of Their Times, they didn't have that much to say good about Cobb's personality. When he went into the stands in 1912 in in the Hilltop Park in New York, and beat up a fan who was giving him the business, and he was suspended. And when they went to Philadelphia for the next series, the Tigers went on strike for a day, and they used replacement players that they just dragged off the streets, and they wound up losing the game. I think it was 24-2. And the strike ended after the one day.
It was a very, very, very unique and unusual game, and that the Philadelphia A's or the Tigers pitched Al Travers, who later was a priest, and they used one of their coaches, Deacon McGuire, who playing in his last major league game, and they did rally behind Cobb when necessary, even though many of them did dislike him. But there were some players who were very loyal to him and strongly felt that he was very instrumental in making their careers much better than they would have been. One was Harry Heilmann, who came to the Tigers near in the late teens and remained with them through the 20s. Heilmann was a right-handed hitter, began as a first baseman, later became an outfielder, and was several times batting champion, a 400 hitter, later Hall of Famer and broadcaster, one of the first former players to turn broadcaster after he left his active career. But meanwhile, the Tigers were, after the 1909 pennant, struggled, even though they finished well up in the standings many seasons. They couldn't break through. And it wasn't until 1934, 1935 when they went back-to-back pennants. In the latter year, they finally emerged as a world champion.
Basically, what I've been able to gather during the 20s, I know in 1915 they won 100 games and missed out by one game against the Red Sox for the AL pennant that year, is that they had hit a lot of hitting with Cobb and Veach and Heilmann and Fothergill and some others. Where they were really lacking was the pitching.
Yeah, they were short on pitching.
George Doss think, went 223 games for them. I believe is still the all-time franchise leader in wins.
Yeah, remarkably, the Tigers are the only one of the 16 original teams that have never had a pitcher who was a 300-game winner on their roster at any point in his career. They've had Hall of Famers, that not many, very few. Hal Newhouser was one, and probably may indeed still stand as the best all-time pitcher for the Tigers. Although, Jason Verlander is certainly going to give him a challenge. But the Tigers, after they won 34-35, they won another pennant in 1940, beating Cleveland by one game in a game Al and I have talked about before. The way the pennant played out when we talked about the Indians, a very, very unique ending, and the Tigers then were beaten in the World Series by the Cincinnati Reds. They still only had one World Championship to their credit going into the 1945 season, the last year of the war. And at that time, their number one player prior to the war had been Hank Greenberg. Greenberg had left, was the first real star, major league star, to leave the major league scene to enlist in the armed forces, and came back just in the nick of time during the 1945 season to fight off a late season challenge from, of all teams, the St. Louis Browns, who had managed to sneak out a win the previous year and take the Tigers into a World Series that a Chicago sports writer famously predicted neither team is good enough to win when the Cubs played the Tigers. And it was the last series, of course, for the Cubs until the 2016 season. It was last pennant for the Tigers for a number of years.
Yeah, going back to the teams in the mid-30s, I mean, they had gotten Mickey Cochran from the A's when Connie Mack ran his fire sale of the great teams that he had in from 1929 to 1931, made Mickey Cochran playing manager. They had Greenberg, they had Charlie Gehringer, who played his whole career there and was a tremendous second baseman. They had Goose Goslin, who incidentally played in all 5 series for the American League teams in the 1920s and 1930s that didn't involve the Yankees or the A's. He was on 3 Washington teams and 2 Detroit teams. They had Marv Owen, the third baseman. The shortstop was
Billy Rogel.
And the outfield, I think, was, besides Goslin, they had Pete Fox and JoJo White. And the pitchers were Tommy Bridges, Schoolboy Rowe. That were the ace pitchers of that team. And they lost to the Gashouse Gang Cardinals in 34, and then they beat the Cubs in 1935. In 1936, Hank Greenberg played, I think, 12 games for that season because he broke his wrist and was out for the year. But,
and then also Mickey Cochran was beaned and never played again. And that pretty much ended the Tigers' short regime as number one team in the American League. The Yankees took over again.
Yeah.
And during the war years, the Browns and Tigers broke through. But after the war years, from 1946 through, the Red Sox won in 46, but then the Yankees dominated except for 48 when Cleveland snuck in.
Yeah, David, I was looking at the 1945 Tigers on Baseball Reference earlier, and I noticed one thing. They had a shortstop named Skeeter Webb. 99 this season.
Yeah, that was very unusual then. Now we have players who hit who bat 199 and have a slugging average of over 400. But at that time, an average Any batting average by a regular below 200 was an extreme rarity. And as Al says, Webb was stood out, for his weak hitting. He wasn't a particularly strong fielder, but he was a good wartime ball player, and stuck around for quite a while and had a pretty good career, all considered.
1950, they had a great season and finished 3 games behind the Yankees. They finished second in the American League that year, led by George Kell and Vic Wertz and Johnny Groth, Hoot Evers. They had, and the pitchers were Newhouser, Dizzy Trout. Virgil Trucks saw on that year, and the rookie, a young pitcher by the name of Art Houseman, who great things were expected of, but never really lived up to his promise. They also did have Billy Pierce in 1940, the late 1940s, and they shipped him to the White Sox for a backup catcher named Aaron Robinson, which is one of the worst deals they ever made. And in 1950, they had a great year. They finished third. Then in 1952, as David mentioned earlier, they dropped into the cellar in 100 losses for the first time, and they unloaded all the players, key players from the team in 1950. And when you look at the team in 1953, almost nobody was there from 1950.
In 1952, Virgil Trucks was still around, and Trucks had a remarkable year. And he won only about 5 games. But 2 of the 5 wins were no-hitters, and this
Another one was
for...
a one-hitter.
Pardon me?
Another one was a one-hitter.
He had a no-hitter and a one-hitter that year?
2 no-hitters and a one-hitter.
2 no-hitters and a one-hitter.
Yeah.
Okay, so 3 of his wins were allowed one hitter or less.
Yeah,
and this was pitching for a last-place team, and this is one of the most remarkable achievements in Major League history. The team lost 100 games. I believe they lost over 100 games. They won like 50.
Yeah,
I think they were 50 to 104.
Yeah.
Or 50 and 100. Yeah.
I think
and
50
then
and 104 is right. Yeah.
Yeah, and then
Browns.
They snuck back into contention by the mid '50s, but they were never really much of a threat to the Yankees, the Indians, or the White Sox.
They brought
Three dominant,
53
basically in that order during the 1950s.
In 1953, they brought in a bonus baby named Al Kaline.
Yeah, Al Kaline came up and had a very, very unusual year as a rookie. His first full season, he holds the record for the fewest runs scored by an outfielder who had 500 or more at bats in the American League. The following year, he became the youngest player in Major League history, and that record still stands, to win a batting crown. And as Al is going to talk about when we get to the later history of the Tigers, Kaline really never fulfilled his tremendous early promise. He had a great career, a long career, all of it spent with the Tigers, but 1950 at age 20 was really his acme.
1955, and the other player that they had who turned out to be very, very good was Harvey Keene, who came there for the last month or two of 1952 and was a consistent 300 hitter and eventually won the batting crown in 1959. He started as a shortstop and he was moved to the outfield.
He wasn't a very good shortstop. Didn't have much range, but for a shortstop, he hit extremely well.
Yeah,
for an outfielder, a corner outfielder, he hit extremely well for average, but didn't have the power, didn't have the speed, and we've talked about how the fact he was involved in the Rocky Colavito trade at the end of the 1959 season, which brought Colavito to Detroit and turned the Detroit team around very quickly, whereas Keene turned the Cleveland team around the other direction very quickly.
Yeah, he was out after 1 year to the Giants. Harvey Keene was sent by Cleveland to the Giants for Willie Kirkland and washed up Johnny Antonelli after the 1960 season.
So Detroit went into the post-expansion era,
well, they went
not having won
1961.
45.
Challenged the Yankees They won 101 games that season, with Colavito and Norm Cash hitting over 40 home runs, Kaline hitting 320, and Frank Larry and Don Marcy and Jim Bunning were the three big pitchers on that team.
They were a very, very, very strong team in '61, but then they really struggled. They went into, they didn't really emerge as a strong contender, and we'll go into, I know Al will talk about the '68 team, which really.
Yeah, in 1967, if they would have beaten the Angels in the last game of the season, they were playing a doubleheader to make up for a rainout. The last Sunday of that season, if they would have won the second game, they would have forced a tie with the Red Sox, and would have had a playoff in the American League for the pennant that year. The next year, in 1968, everything clicked, and that was the year Danny McLean won 31 games, followed by Mickey Lolich, who won 17. And the team got off to a very, very good start. And basically, the American League race, and this was the last year of the 10 teams before the 1969 split into divisions, and they basically had the American League pennant clinched by the end of June. And they had Kaline was still there, and they had Jim Northrup, Willie Horton, Cash was still there.
And the immortal Gates Brown,
one
of the greatest pinch hitters of all time for at least that season.
Bill Freehand, there was a catcher. A lot of people think, there are people who think that Freehand belongs in the Hall of Fame. And second baseman who just passed away last year, Dick McAuliffe. And they wound up playing the Cardinals in the World Series that year. Was expected. They were expected. They were a big underdog, and what they did was, in order to get Kaline into the World Series, because he'd become the fourth outfielder during the season, they took Mickey Stanley, who was the center fielder, and they put him at shortstop, because the shortstop they had was
Ray Euler.
Ray Euler, who batted a scintillating 135 that season.
And one of the most amazing seasons ever.
And
really.
Euler would wind up going to the expansion of Seattle Pilots in the draft after that season. And they wound up coming back with a 3-1 deficit and beat the Cardinals 4-3. Mickey Lolich, who was the second starting pitcher on the team, became the World Series hero, somewhat like Lou Burdett in 1957. Mickey Lolich beat the Cardinals 3 times, including beating Bob Gibson in Game 7. So that
it was a very hard fought series all the way, and there were a couple of key plays. What some people think was a misjudged, drive off the. I think it was off the bat of Northrup, wasn't it, Al? That misjudged, and that pretty much decided the 7th game.
I don't think Flood ever really recovered from that.
No, I don't either.
Yeah, and so then after 1969, McLean won 24 games and shared the Cy Young Award with Mike Cuellar of the Orioles. And then in 1970, he was suspended for half the season by Bowie Kuhn for consorting with gamblers. And he came back. He was 3-5. I mean, Kuhn had a whole big to-do over this. And they traded him to Washington after the 1970 season. And they wound up getting Joe Coleman, who would be a 20-game winner, and the whole left side of the infield with Eddie Brinkman and at shortstop and Aurelio Rodriguez at third base. McLean went on to have a record of 10-22 in Washington, and basically he was out of the major leagues a year later.
Yeah.
They went on to win the division by half a game over Boston in 1972 because the players' strike at the beginning of that season wiped out the first 2 weeks, and those games were not made up, which was ironic because in 1908 they had won the pennant by half over Cleveland. a game over the White Sox because they weren't required back then to make up rained-out games that affected the pennant race. So the only team in history ever to win once, at least even once by half a game, and they did this twice. And the team took the A's to 5 games in the American League Championship Series before losing. Ralph Houck was the manager at this. Billy Martin managed that team. He left after 1972, and they brought in Ralph Houck. And in 1975, they collapsed, and they finished again. They lost over 100 games. They were the worst team in the major leagues. Everybody got old. They didn't replace people. Caroline had retired. And then there was a slow, gradual comeback, which again resulted in the team in 1984 that went 35-5 and went on to win the LCS over Kansas City and beat the San Diego Padres in 5 games in the World Series. Kirk Gibson put the kibosh on the Padres by hitting a 3-run home run off Goose Gossage in the last game.
And we should say something at this point about the Tigers. The Tigers are still playing on the same site.
Oh yeah.
In 1984, when they won their 3rd World Championship, that they occupied in 1901. 1901, they opened in a park called Bennett Field, which was named after a former Detroit catcher with the Wolverines and their championship team in '87, who had lost both legs in a railway accident. He was very tough, very, very formidable catcher in the 1880s, and some think even belongs in the Hall of Fame. And the park was named in his honor in 1901, and then eventually the Tigers expanded to Navin Field, and Navin Field became Briggs Stadium, and then it became Tiger Stadium. This was still the park the Tigers were occupying in 1984. So here's a team from 1984 back in 2001 still playing at the same site they were all those years ago. And no other team in Major League history can make anything close to a similar claim. They had a stability that was very, very, very unusual.
Yeah, the park also hosted for years they hosted the Detroit Lions, the NFL team that came in to existence in 1935 and won the championship the first year of existence. And of course, they named them the Lions. Basically, it was a play on the Tigers. And the Lions played there for, I think, something like 50 years before they went to that Silverdome. But also, I had read once where one of their programs, when I was at a game there years and years ago, that originally when they were converting it in before they reopened it in 1910, they had the field laid out wrong, where the sun would come into the batter's eyes, and Crawford and Cobb complained about it. They went down there, they took a survey, and they turned the whole park around so the sun would not get into his eyes, and it became one of the great hitting parks in the major leagues for its entire existence.
It was also one of the last parks to put in lights.
Yeah.
And Detroit, sad to say, it was one of the next to last major league team to integrate its roster. It wasn't until it was 58 Al when Al Virgil. Virgil, came in and joined. Prior to, and then the Red Sox followed suit. Finally, became the 16th and last major league team to integrate. But the Tigers suffered as a result of that in the 50s. They could have had much stronger teams if they joined the Indians and the Dodgers, the Giants, and several other major league teams, which found a chance to sign black players.
The American League as a whole was much slower than the National League because for years, the early years that the Indians were basically the only team in the American League that went after black ball players.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, the Indians, the Browns franchise did to a point, and then the Orioles franchise did, and then, but the Tigers and really laggards, and so were the Red Sox, and
the Yankees.
It was unfortunate, but by the 60s, the Tigers had some very strong black talent with Horton and Gates Brown and the pitcher Earl Wilson.
Red Sox. Jake Wood, who's the regular second baseman in 1961. Yeah, it was slow. But after 1984, when they just destroyed the American League, Jack Boris was the ace pitcher. They won the division fairly handily in 1987. But even though they were heavily favored going into the ALCS, they were beaten by the Twins in 5 games.
Yeah.
And then a decline started. And in 1994, they went from 1994 through 2005 without a winning record, which I think is the longest streak in their history.
It is.
And they had 2 really, really brutal years. In 2002, they won 55 games. And in 2003, they won 43. They won 43 and 119. And because they got hot in the last week of the season, they missed losing 120 games and joining the New York Mets, 1962 Mets in that category. And that team was just absolutely brutal. They had a pitcher named Mike Baroth who won 7 and lost 21. He was the last pitcher in the major leagues to lose 20 games in the season.
And there'll probably never be another one because the stigma attached to it is so severe that...
I was looking at the numbers for the 75 team for 2002-2003. These teams had around 240. They had on-base average of around 300. Combined OPS somewhere in the around 600. I mean, they just didn't get men on base. They couldn't hit. Pitchers, of course, suffered because they knew that they would go out there and they'd be lucky if they get one or 2 runs. And besides Maroth, they had a pitcher named Marty Conejo, who went, I think, 6 and 17. Another pitcher named Jeremy Bonderman, who also, I think the 5 top pitchers had a combined record of something like 28 wins and 78 losses. These are the top pitchers on the staff. So obviously, poor Alan Travel, who was a bulwark of the 1984 team, he and the second baseman Lou Whitaker played together for, I think, 18 or 19 years. Poor Alan Trammell was the manager of that team, and he's never gotten another chance since.
It's unfortunate. Trammell was one of the Tigers' finest players of all time, and there are a lot of shortstops in the Hall of Fame who really could not hold a candle to Alan Trammell. I saw him play a number of times, and he had all the tools. He could hit, he could field, he could run, and he was a team player. He was an excellent player, and I think with a decent cast, he could have been a pretty good major league manager. And it's sad that he never got another chance.
Well, after the disaster of 2003, they started to slowly rebuild, and by the time 2006 rolled around, they were in the World Series where they were swept by the Cardinals, and they finished first in the division 4 years in a row, and 2006 was the only year they made the World Series out of those 4 teams. And they again made the World Series in 2011, and again lost to the Cardinals, this time in 5 games. And they put together some very, very good players. Currently, they have Justin Verlander, who, as David indicated earlier, may be the one to break the total wins by a Tiger pitcher of 223 held by George Doss. And they have a budding Hall of Famer on the team, turned out to be one of the best hitters of this age, Miggy Cabrera, who 3 years ago became the first player in the major leagues to win a hitting triple crown in 45 years. 46.
Yeah, they've got a good cast. They were short of Cleveland last year. They've got some catching up to do, but I think they're going to be a 500 team or better next year.
Yes,
and with a couple breaks here and there, anything can happen. Major League Baseball now.
Yeah, the fans there are extremely loyal. As I mentioned earlier, it's a great hitting park. Ted Williams, they had the 1941 All-Star game in Brick Stadium. That's where Ted Williams hit the 3-run home run in the bottom of the ninth to give the American League a victory. And Ted Williams said if he played all his whole career in that place, he would have hit 400 a number of times.
It was a great, all throughout their history, the Tigers have had a great hitting park. And they've had, as a result, they've had more than their share of batting leaders. Ty Cobb, of course, being the most prominent, but Heilman won several. Kaline
won one. George Kell won one.
Yeah.
Cash
won.
Year, which was totally out of proportion to every other year in his career. And
well, he got hot. And it was the first year of expansion where a lot of hitters got hot, and the pitching just wasn't deep enough to even out the scale as it did in other years.
So they have a very, very rich history in the American League and in baseball. They've won a number of pennants in World Series, and
they've always had the same logo ever since 1901. Same nickname. There's a tremendous stability in Detroit that people don't recognize. They really don't receive the credit they do them for. Other teams have had to fight off the possibility that they're going to be moved, like Cleveland. That they've changed stadiums a number of times. They've changed nicknames. They've tried everything. The Tigers have just stayed the Tigers, and they've been a very strong franchise for the most part.
They're one of the three teams, along with the Yankees and the Red Sox in the American League, that still have the classic uniforms. The Tigers with that old English D.
Yeah.
I remember one time they tried to put a tiger in the D for the cap. That didn't go over too well. So back to the plain English D. And you're right, there's a tremendous amount of tradition with that franchise. And, they really have a good history behind them.
And Detroit was at one time, one of the top 5 cities in population. That suffered a lot in recent years. It's no longer there, but the fans are still there, and the tradition is there, and baseball is always going to be there, I think, in Detroit.
Oh yeah, and they're in a division where they play. They're in a division with the Indians and the White Sox and the Twins and the Royals, and the first three, the White Sox, the Indians, and the Twins, they have histories going back to 1901 with all those teams, because the Twins were in Washington before 1961.
And essentially, Detroit is probably the largest market team among those 5 teams, and they're really not a major market team, although they try to be, and they've got a formidable payroll at the moment. The division is a solid division, but it's usually wide open from year to year because the teams fluctuate rather violently because their payrolls change very quickly.
Yeah, you're right, and but again, most of the time the fans out there have had something to look forward to. Their highs and lows are. They've had some really bad lows in the last 40 years or so, but again, everybody was ready to write them off completely after the 2003 fiasco. but they did rebound from that, and they put out a relatively competitive product every year.
Absolutely, yeah, and they're a good team to watch. Always fun.
Yes. Okay, David, I appreciate this very, very much.
Thank you, Al. Really a pleasure once again to be with you.
Okay, and we'll be back hopefully next week, same bad time, same bad channel. Thank you, David. Good night.
Thanks, Al.